This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Good news! The ASA 2021 conference will be taking place online from the 30th of November to the 2nd of December, meaning that people all around the world will be able to take part. So make sure you get those dates in your diary. They're in mine. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a series of academic books on animal studies. There have been 4 released this year, bringing the total number in the series to 18. The most recent book is Animal Dreams, a collection of essays by David Brooks. Now, I've been listening back to some old episodes of Knowing Animals recorded by Siobhan, and I always liked hearing about the conferences she was attending. As many of you will know, Siobhan often recorded episodes face-to-face while at conferences. Though I had known his work for a while, I bumped into today's guest at an interdisciplinary conference called Veganism, a Paradigm Shift in June. And then we ended up on the same panel a few weeks later at the European Association for Critical Animal Studies. It felt only natural that I should talk to him at length for the podcast. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr Vasile Stanescu. Vasile is an Associate Professor of Communication Studies at Mercer University in the United States. Lots of listeners will know him for his work in critical animal studies. He co-edits the Critical Animal Studies book series published by Brill. He's a former co-editor of the Journal for Critical Animal Studies and a co-founder of the North American Association for Critical Animal Studies. Today, we're going to talk about his paper, White Power Milk, Dietary Racism and the Alt-Right, which was published in 2018 in Animal Studies Journal. Welcome to the podcast, Vasile.
Thank you for having me.
So can you start by telling us what inspired you to work on this topic?
Well, it was an interesting thing that sometimes happens of a convergence of different areas that I was studying, that while I was studying them, I had no idea that they actually went together. And then I discovered these interlinking areas between these 3 different areas. So I was studying, actually my dissertation work was on these sort of odd claims that people make that consuming meat or dairy is what makes us human, in a kind of evolutionary sense of that term. And I had also previously done work on what is referred to as effeminate rice eaters, or kind of claim during the late 18th and early 19th century that eating meat and dairy was what made colonial folk strong and aggressive and smart. So that was my previous work. And then I became interested in these memes that people on the alt-right, i.e. neo-Nazis, were using around meat and dairy, and in particular dairy, to highlight their supposed masculinity, strength, and white superiority.
Good. So let's start with these memes that also, of course, have spread out into the world beyond the internet. So for those of us who maybe aren't familiar with this, could you tell us what's going on with the alt-right and milk?
Yeah, well, it's very fascinating. So the alt-right in the United States started tweeting jokes. So, for example, Richard Spencer, who supposedly coined the term alt-right, started tweeting, "I'm very tolerant, lactose tolerant." They started guzzling large things of milk, pouring milk on top of themselves and filming it. And in a host of different ways, just tried to use milk to signify their whiteness, and actually would retweet from academic works articles about lactose tolerance and the supposed benefits that consuming milk conferred on people.
Yeah, so this just sounds bizarre in many ways, but you actually see this as part of a much longer history linking ideas about racial superiority with the consumption of milk. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. And so one of my concerns, one of the reasons I wrote this article, is these sort of memes were being written off by the mainstream publications as just another oddity of I think we can all agree, very odd group, and without meaning anything else. It's just sort of this one-off ironic expression. But the reality is that starting in the 18th and 19th century, the colonial powers, England, also the United States, the Western colonial powers, started this idea that it was the consumption of meat and dairy that was actually conferring the ability to colonize the entire rest of the world. The term they used was the effeminate rice eater. Let me give you a couple of examples. Gandhi mentions this in his autobiography. So he briefly consumes meat, and the reason he gives is because of this idea that it would make him strong. So part of his anti-colonial struggle against the British oppression was actually a temporary consumption of meat, which he then later gives up. Or to give you another example of just how common this phenomenon was, I recently came across a writing instruction book during this time period. And so it'll be for young school children. So it'll be like, T is for tiger. Here is a tiger. Here's the letter T. R is for rice. Here is rice. People who consume rice are not as strong as the rest of us. So that was the degree of prevalence of this idea, that the reason why white folks, these colonial powers, were dominating people in India, people in Mesoamerica, was because of dietary differences. And the solution then became, if we could just force them to eat meat and dairy like the colonial powers, we can quote unquote fix them and actually improve them. So this was seen as somehow more progressive than earlier, more explicitly racist ideas based on biology. And these problems could be solved via changes in nutrition.
This might be quite a tricky question, but to what extent do you think that there's a direct relationship between these racist scientific conversations in the 19th century and the racist Twitter rants of the alt-right today? Do you think that these are part of the same conversation? Or is it perhaps the case that claims about milk consumption and racial superiority have arisen independently in both cases?
That's a fantastic question. And the most fascinating thing for me that I found in the research was a almost direct connection. And so in the article that you mentioned, I actually start with multiple examples of peer-reviewed publications of people publishing now, both in peer-reviewed journals and outside of peer-reviewed journals like The Economist and PBS, who are making similar type arguments as were made by academics. These were academics making these arguments in the late 18th and 19th century that are explicitly arguing that is the consumption of dairy, which supposedly gave these colonial powers an edge over other people by giving them excess calories. One of the arguments is that it decreased infant mortality rates, which allowed better raising, and even, this is just a quote of the argument they're making, people to care more about their individual children because they died less, which they claim led to greater empathy, greater democracy. These are peer-reviewed academic claims saying the consumption of dairy, therefore, is what leads to things like democracy or human rights. So I hope we can all see that these kind of are absurd claims, but they're absurd claims happening by academics in academic work, and then are being directly, and I mean word for word, reproduced by the alt-right and neo-Nazis as a kind of pseudo-intellectual justification for what they're doing in their racist journals, in 4chan, etc. Now, as I'm very clear in the article and now, in no way am I claiming that these academics are causing the alt-right or causing neo-Nazism or are responsible in the way that their work is being used and misused. But I am saying that this type of work is very dangerous, that they should perhaps be thinking through some of the ethical implications of the type of work that they're doing. And in any case, it is simply a factually true statement that many racist folk are looking at this work and citing it word for word as a way to justify their own pre-existing white supremacist views.
Yes, so I'm glad you used that word dangerous. This is a conversation that's come up on Knowing Animals a few times in a few different contexts about the potential danger of research being taken out of context or developing a life of its own after being produced. So could you say a little bit more about what you mean by this work being dangerous? And how do you think researchers should respond to the danger that might be inherent in their work? So, for example, I had a long conversation with Bob Fisher a few months ago about allowing the argument to lead us where it goes, even if that might lead to conclusions that could be unpalatable or could be taken out of context. So, what might you say to people who are engaging in this nutrition research or this genetic research that is then being used by these far right activists?
So there's kind of a few different groups. So there's some research that is less problematic. It is clearly historically situated in the past, and it makes a series of arguments about different population levels that occurred in the past. Perhaps that research is incorrect, but they're not generalizing beyond what I would suggest would be their level of expertise, and they're not claiming to try to tell us how to understand what is happening now. There is another part of this work of saying how consumption of dairy products that tries to generalize what is happening now. And this is still done in academic journals and by academic folk, but that work, I think, is very troubling. And so they will say, we can actually still tell why there is colonialism now because of a legacy of nutritional differences. So one of the things I highlight is there are people who have done this type of work who, while discussing colonialism and differences in wealth between nations, have never even used the word race. Even if they're right and consumption of dairy conferred some type of evolutionary advantage at some point, made a few countries wealthier than some other countries, they still take it as a given that wealthier countries would then attack and exploit other countries. They also confuse colonialism, which actually is one of the major ways in which countries like Europe made their wealth. They mix up the cause and effect, where it was colonialism that actually made the colonizing countries wealthy and the colonized countries poor. And they flip it and imagine is the wealth of being European, which is what allowed colonialism to happen. So the point is, what I'm particularly concerned about is researchers who do this kind of pseudo-evolution, this kind of like working backwards from how things are now. And we can see this, there's a history of this from phrenology on, where they're like, look, the reason things are the way they are now is because of my pseudo-evolutionary research I'm doing. And so things are the way they're in essence supposed to be. And I can do this by going way back. And that's beyond anyone's expertise and has serious political problems for the world we find ourselves in currently.
Yes, so it does actually sound like the researchers making those kinds of claims could share some of the blame here. There is a sloppiness in what they're doing. It's not just that their work is being taken out of context.
That is correct. I mean, some researchers who are doing research around meat and dairy in the historical context are very careful to say, look, we're talking about a specific time period and no way are we generalizing towards the future. Other researchers are not. And actually, they're doing the opposite. And they're saying, look, I can explain wealth inequality, achievement gaps, all these sorts of things, looking at lactose tolerance, which tends to be coded racially, and as a way to actually recode differences about race in a way that is now has a degree of intellectual legitimacy because of instead of explicitly saying Black or Asian or what have you, you're implicitly saying it by saying I'm talking about lactose tolerance. And the people who are predominantly Northern European who have lactose tolerance are able to achieve these things and the other folks are not.
Yes, and it's perhaps worth being explicit here about lactose tolerance because this is something that I didn't realize until I started working on the ethics of veganism a few years ago, just how few people in the world, comparatively speaking, are lactose tolerant. Whereas, in certain contexts, such as in the UK, where I am, lactose intolerance is seen as it's pathologized, it's medicalized, it's abnormal. Whereas on a global level, it perhaps isn't abnormal.
You're exactly correct. We actually should not use the phrase, even though I've done it several times already, lactose intolerance, which suggests that the as you say, the pathological disease is an inability to digest milk. Globally, it's exactly the opposite. There are a small number of people who have developed the genetic adaptation to be able to digest lactose for some period of their life, although virtually everyone, even in Britain, will lose this capability. But that is what is rare. What is more statistically common is an inability to digest lactose. And as I mentioned, most people from Africa do not have the ability to digest lactose. Most people of Asian descent do not have the ability to digest lactose. So when you have a program, for example, we have in the United States where they give school children milk, the government pays for it, and pretty much the only beverage for most school children in public schools is milk. It's a kind of dietary racism against the predominantly non-white people who are consuming this and perhaps getting sick every day while they go to school.
You and I are both, broadly speaking, animal liberationists or animal rights advocates. And so you and I are worried about milk and dairy because of, among other reasons, what is done to cows or goats or, whichever animal is being abused to produce this milk. But do you think that these entanglements between dairy and racism provide further reasons to be worried about the consumption of dairy?
Well, one of the odd things that this article happened with this article. So the editor of the article sent me an email a while back saying, your article is the most downloaded article that we've published, and it's in a host of different countries and languages, and we can't figure out why. And what turned out is that there was a protest movement that's happened in a few countries, for example, Brazil, where they were throwing dairy on their leaders or politicians that they thought were supporters of the alt-right or fascist. And so it became kind of like glitter bombing or what have you. It became this, or pieing people. It became this kind of non-violent type of protest to mark them as being fascist by throwing milk on them. And then when people are like, why are you doing this? They would tweet, and they would tweet a link to the article. And so in one sense, they got the article completely wrong, since they are now consuming more dairy, hurting more cows, and normalizing dairy. In another sense, they got the article exactly correct, which is connecting fascism, white supremacy, and violence against non-human animals in this kind of history of these linkages. So I do think there's a linkage in the United States context. There is a myth that vegans are predominantly white. In reality, African Americans are disproportionately likely to be vegetarian or vegan, and the fastest growing group of vegans in the United States. Although this is within African American communities that are focused on this, is sometimes articulated differently than the sort of mainstream animal rights movements, and has more, I think, really important arguments about things like the dietary racism, giving milk to children who are lactose tolerant, food deserts, lack of access to healthy and sustainable food and protests. And so I think there are broader, important conversations about race and animals that the mainstream animal rights movement has not done enough to address.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I was going to actually ask about these links between violence and racism, violence towards animals and racism, because what's quite striking in some ways, given that this was published in Animal Studies Journal, is that actually you don't talk about cows that much. You don't talk about animals that much. So what do you think is the relationship between violence against animals and for example, the derogatory comments made about effeminate rice eaters or soy boys?
Just to clarify, soy boys is the most common pejorative term used by the alt-right to refer to people that they're opposed to suggest that they are not manly enough because of the idea that they consume soy. And it too has a kind of pseudoscientific backing around incorrect science around the consumption of estrogen, making people less manly. But what I would say about these kinds of connections is that there has been a quite lengthy history of the way in which racism, sexism, homophobia, and violence against animals and support of dairy have worked together. One of the things that I highlight in the article is that in the United States context, one of the ways in which effeminate rice eaters worked was working class populations, people who are trying to unionize in the US, were demanding higher wages. And their articulation was, we don't have enough money to be able to buy meat. I like a chicken in every pot. In fact, they claimed, these union organizers, we don't have enough money to buy meat. We are being as poorly treated as the then Asian immigrants who all they can afford to do is eat rice. We can't get our manly meat. Our white manhood is being attacked. And they, in essence, were bought off by cheap meat. So they did win the right to be able to afford meat, not by their wages going up, but by the cost of meat going down. And so I think we have to ask ourselves these arguments like, why do factory farms exist? And part of that answer is that factory farms, i.e., government support of ever cheaper meat and dairy products, has been part of a system that has justified vast wealth inequality and decreased labor organization, what have you, by instead of improving people's real wages or livelihood, by always buying them off with cheaper and cheaper meat.
That's fascinating. Now, I'd like to just close this part of our conversation by asking you about the title of the paper. Could you introduce us to white power milk and tell us why you chose to refer to it in the title?
Yes. So white power milk is not only a reference to these alt-right groups, it is also a reference to the sort of long history about people who have already seen these sort of connections or been making these articles. So one can Google white power milk, and the first thing that comes up is a website which is still up. So I encourage people to go to it, by a mixed race performance artist who is making exactly this kind of argument. And so what he has on this website is a series of white women who have pseudo biographies beside their names. So example, they went to Harvard and have such and such GPA. And then the website purports that these women will gargle milk and sell this milk to people who want their milk gargled by white women before they drink it. And the images are clearly both white and sexual, this gargling of the milk, which they show. And then what is remarkable is that large numbers of people could not tell whether this was parody or if this was an actual real product for purchase on both sides. So there were people who were scandalized that this was occurring and people who were actively trying to purchase milk gargled by white women for sale. And the name of this project is White Power Milk. And so the point of that is that this kind of iconography of white milk and race and gender are so intertwined in our kind of cultural consciousness that something as absurd as white power milk of wealthy white women gargling milk was something that people actually believed could exist.
Incredible. Now, Vasile, we ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. I was 9 years old and I checked it out from my public library.
9 years old. I was going to say we get a lot of people saying Peter Singer, but I'm not sure we've had someone say Peter Singer that young before. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes, Green Eggs and Ham, The Myth of Sustainable Meat and the Danger of the Local. It was a critique of localism.
And where was that one published?
That was published in 2010 in the Critical Animal Studies Journal, so 11 years ago.
And if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Carol Adams. And that's at 2 levels. She sort of personally has mentored me my entire academic life. But in addition, she does something where she'll give this talk and she'll say, now, how many of you read Animal Liberation and it made you go? And she says go and she pauses. And so a bunch of us start to raise our hand. And then she says utilitarian. And then we all awkwardly have to put our hands down. And her point is that while Peter Singer may be right about the need for us to go vegetarian or vegan, he might also well be wrong for the need for us to be utilitarian. And I agree precisely with this critique.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Provide accurate data for activists. And I'll give two very short, quick examples. I had a debate with Bruce Friedrich, and he argued that only 2% or less of people in the United States were vegetarian, but that data is just untrue. It's based on a blog post by an intern with a master's degree in computer science and one study that was never submitted for peer review. The numbers are much higher. They're as high as 12% under the age of 50. So if you're trying to base your strategy on whether the people in the United States are 2% are vegetarian or 12%, that's a huge difference. One other quick example, people argue consumerist options are a good way to help animals, but in the United States context, exactly what we're talking about in terms of this article, the United States gives the dairy industry, give or take $40 billion each year. 42% of all the money that the dairy industry makes is directly from the government. So even if individual people stop consuming dairy, dollar for dollar within the United States, it's just replaced by the government.
And if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
The idea that humans own or control or should speak for animals. Animals exist for their own reasons.
And what are you working on next?
Well, there is an update to this project. So I'm trying to think through Heifer International, which seems sort of a direct continuation of this effeminate rice eater idea, where the myth is that we need to give them cows, not only because of belief of they're hungry or they don't have enough food, but the belief that somehow meat uniquely and specifically will fix the poverty of the world. And Heifer International has even started working with factory farms like ConAgra to specifically try to train historically vegetarian populations in India to make, grow, and consume meat.
And how can people find out more about your work?
Everything I do, I post on academia.edu. So as soon as the articles come out and I can negotiate whatever copyright restrictions that are in place, I upload the articles there. The podcast interviews are there. Recordings of my talks are there. academia.edu.
Well, thanks, Vasile, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for doing this podcast.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook, and you can just find us at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. And please do review the podcast if you've enjoyed it, or maybe even if you haven't. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.